Welcome to the show, guys. Joseph Robert Camo, the fantasy football counselor. In this video, we are talking about fantasy football explained. I wanted to dive in here. We're in the off season. I want to dive in to do some fantasy football 101 and help people who may look this up. Fantasy football explained. What is fantasy football? People want to know. I'm going to answer that in detail right here for you guys in the video. Linked below are some other 101 videos, including fantasy football draft strategy and how to win fantasy football. Click on the link here below. And also, guys, get the 16-round draft solution. This is the way to win fantasy football. It's like having me at the draft with you. I've linked it there below for you guys. Get the 16-round draft solution where I give you all the optimal players to draft in each round. So if you are new to fantasy football, this is going to help you not only come into fantasy football and understand it, but also crush your league mates. So be like, oh my God, this guy just started. Johnny just started in our league. How do you win? Well, he got 16-round draft solution. So I've linked it below. And of course, guys, the show is brought to you by pristineauction.com. We do giveaways all the time. We're signed swag, signed helmets, signed jerseys, signed footballs, compliments of Pristine Auction to enter for all these draws moving forward, guys. And again, if you are new to fantasy football, this is great. You can probably win something here. Go to pristineauction.com, use code SWAGLION when you create an account, and you're entered automatically. That's pristineauction.com, code SWAGLION. So let's answer the question. Fantasy football explained. What is fantasy football? Now, there's so many definitions of this that people may use, but I like to call it a virtual game that I'm passionate about. Now, I'm passionate about football, but this is a chance where you can actually own your team. Now, you and I are unlikely to be millionaires. I mean, most people listen to this video, myself, it's a very rare breed to be a millionaire, okay? It's not easy to obtain because it's hard to own a team because all teams are worth over $1 billion, right? Football teams, that is. So to own a franchise is expensive. So fantasy football gives you the opportunity to own your virtual team, right? So for example, if I draft a player, let's just say, for example, Justin Herbert, for example, okay? I draft him on my team. He is now my team. I own him. Now we're talking year-long fantasy football where you draft a team at the beginning of the year and you pretty much ride with that team throughout the season. Now there's waiver wire pickups and trades you can do and other stuff, but you're pretty much with that team the entire year. So I draft, let's say, Justin Herbert on my fantasy team. I theoretically own that guy. So when he puts out points in a real-life game, right? He's in a real-life game playing, right? Those points are now accumulated on my virtual fantasy roster. Now, there's tons of ways you can play fantasy football. You can play it on different platforms. And I'm not going to say those platforms. Just Google, how to play fantasy football or fantasy football leagues. You can join, okay? A lot of four-letter networks have platforms and stuff like that. You can play on those platforms. So you're drafting a virtual team, right? That's what fantasy football is. And you own that team and you manage that team throughout the season, throughout the actual NFL season. So when you look at a fantasy football team, what makes it so exciting and why it's so popular is because of the fact that you own that team, you're managing it, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty means excitement, right? That curiosity, right? How's my player going to do this week? How's he going to perform when you're watching your roster? Now, a lot of people are saying this is very tedious, it's a lot of work, it's too hard. It's actually really not. If you know football, you watch football, or even if you follow stats, it's very easy to follow. And then the advantage to fantasy football particularly is that it's pretty much done weekly, okay, guys? So, fantasy football explained, what is it? You draft a virtual team, you own a virtual team of real-life players. They're real-life players, but they're on your team because they're accumulating fantasy points, right? A player throws a touchdown in real life, you're going to get fantasy points for it on your roster if you own that player, right? So it's exciting. It's really, really... It really puts you into the game and it enhances that game watching experience. Now, I'll give you an example, right? If you own a running back from, let's say, the Jacksonville Jaguars, you may not like the Jacksonville Jaguars, but you'll feel like you want to watch, and you will most likely watch that game to watch that player perform. So you end up watching more games. You end up typically rooting for your player over the actual team. And that's why people ask me all the time, like, Joe, what's your favorite team? And I'm just like, you know what? I don't really have a favorite team. My favorite team is where my fantasy player is playing, right? That's my favorite team. So, let me dive into a little bit more about explaining fantasy football here, but I just wanted to give you kind of that scope there. It's a virtual team you draft, right? It's real life players. You own them, and they accumulate points on your roster. and then you basically, you compete with other players in your league, right? So there's different league types, right? There's PPR, which is points, points per catch, and there's standard league, there's half point PPR. So if your running back or receiver catches the ball, they might get a point. That's called PPR, right? So there's different formats. There's 8-person, 6-person, 10-person, 12-person, 14-person leagues. The more players in your fantasy football league, the less likely you're going to have those really good players that perform, right? Because there's players that perform really well in fantasy that get a lot of volume on their teams, and then there's players that don't get as much volume, okay? And that's why you got to study depth charts and all that stuff. And I do that in the 16-round draft solution, okay? I do all that work for you guys for the most part. I give you guys all the optimal players to draft in each round. So how does this work? What do I do? What does a draft have? How does this work? So you basically do a draft to draft your roster. Now, this can be done online with your friends and league mates, or you can do in-person drafts, right, where it's done via draft board. So what you do is you basically do some studying. Now, what happens is, and how I differ, is that these rankings come out every year from the mainstream, what I call consensus. They come out with their consensus rankings, and these are typically predicated on last year's top finishers. So if a quarterback did well last year, they're going to tell you to suggest them to draft in early rounds this year, right? So you want to kind of think outside the box. Again, that's where I'm plugging my 16 rounds, because that's where I teach you guys how to draft the optimal players without following the consensus rankings, because the consensus rankings won't help you because everything changes, right? If the player did well last year doesn't mean he's going to do well this year at all, okay? So you get ready with your friends, 10-person league, 6-person league, whatever, 12-person league. I prefer the 12-person league, and I like the 1-point PPR. I like getting that point per reception. This is my preference, and I think it's one of the most popular ways to play fantasy football, right? So you get together, you gather some friends, either you get together in person or online, and most of these platforms, or all of them, you can do an online draft. You get together, let's say 8 o'clock a week before the season starts. Now, when do you draft? People start drafting as early as May, which is crazy. Maybe even April, right? Right after the NFL draft happens and the players are on the new teams, and you know who the rookies are. People draft very early in fantasy football, but it's not recommended because that player may get hurt, right? One of the players you draft on your team gets hurt. Now you've wasted a draft pick, right? So you want to draft as close as you possibly can to the NFL season. So typically the season starts first week of September for football. An ideal time to be drafting would be maybe a week or two before the season starts. Again, if you draft a player and he gets hurt, that's really going to hurt you potentially for fantasy football. Now, I like to draft earlier because I know how to draft a lot of depth, and I know who those sleepers and breakouts are. And again, I offer all that in 16-round draft solution. I know that. I'm aware of that. So for me, drafting earlier is actually advantageous because a lot of players come out and they actually end up breaking out in preseason a week or so before, and everybody's riding that train, drafting their ADP, their average draft position, goes a little higher, okay? So, again, if you're newer, you want to draft a little closer to the season. So what happens at the draft? You draft your team, and now typically this is done via, you could do an auction draft, which is not as popular, or you can do it via snake draft. Well, what's a snake draft, Joe? Very simple. You draft with your first pick, right? Your first pick, right? Let's say your first overall pick at a 12-person league, you draft, your entire league drafts, and the person who drafted 12th is going to draft 13th as well. It's going to snake back to you. So if you're drafting first overall in your league, you get the first pick and the 24th pick in a 12-person league. Does that make sense? So you're going to draft first, you're going to wait till everybody else drafts, and they come back and draft again, you're going to come back. Again, you get first overall pick, but you got to wait 24 picks. I personally like drafting 12th. That way, I get to go 12 and 13. I got two nice picks pretty early on, all right? So that's pretty much what happens. You draft, and snake draft typically is the more popular way to draft. You draft your team. Now you're set, and you wait for week 1, okay? Now, there is daily fantasy as well, which is different. I'm not going to dive into daily fantasy. We're talking year-long. But daily fantasy football is typically, there's DraftKings and FanDuel. You draft that roster for that team. They perform that team that week, and then that's it. They're good for a week. You enter these player pools with a bunch of players that there's bets on it and stuff like that. But we're not talking DFS here. We're just talking year long. Okay, so that's daily fantasy. So what you do is you draft your team, very simple, and then you wait for week 1 and you edit your roster. Okay, when you edit your roster, you're going to try to start your best players, the players that you drafted earlier, the players that are the volume getters, right? You draft them earlier, you drafted them earlier, and you want to ideally try to start them, right? Now you're going to have a set roster position. So you're going to have quarterback, and each league is different, right? You have your quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a flex play, a defense. Some leagues have defenses in their defense special teams, and some have individual defensive players. What is a flex spot? A flex spot is a place you can set up on your roster, right? Where your commissioner, your league, the person that runs your league, right? That has access to all the setting up your league, your draft date and all that stuff. He basically goes in, or he or she goes in and edits that, position to accommodate. You could put, a tight end, a wide receiver, a running back in that flex spot. And then there's super flex as well, where you can put a quarterback and have a 2. Now you're theoretically in a 2 quarterback league. So you might want to draft quarterbacks early. So I'm just trying to kind of give you an overview here. There's a lot. I know it's a lot to absorb if you're definitely new to this, but Fantasy Football Explained, you have a virtual team. You compete every week with your league mates for the most points. Now, again, your league can be set head-to-head every week, and the person with the best record wins. The person with the most points for wins. Depends on how your league is set up. Each league is different. But in summary here, guys, Fantasy Football Explained, guys, very simple. You research these NFL players, right? You draft a team. You're in a league with 10, 12 people, 14 people. Each week you edit your roster. Very simple, starting your best players. You fill those slots. You're going to have some bench players as well. You fill those slots, okay? And you compete every single week. Now, you don't really compete. You literally do nothing. You set up your lineup and you watch. But what makes it so fun is that you're watching the game knowing that when a real player performs, those players are, accumulating fantasy points on your fantasy roster, okay? So you're competing, you're watching, you're cheering on your fantasy players to succeed. Now, again, what makes it more exciting is that you could have a league fee where your buy-in is $100 per person and the winner take all, right, by the end of the year. So there's a lot of incentives to make it more exciting depending on your commissioner. You can have a league trophy every single year, right? But if you are new to fantasy, I definitely recommend you guys do click that subscribe button. I'll be doing more one-on-one videos, and I've linked some awesome videos below for you guys, including a beginner's guide there for you, and also a fantasy football draft strategy so that you have a competitive edge over the competition. All right. Now, how many people play fantasy football? A lot. A lot of people play fantasy football. In fact, approximately 60 million people across North America play it. And I know I have fans that DM me from Australia and England and across and overseas, from Mexico even, down south. So there's a lot of people that play it. It's extremely fun. It's extremely addictive. And it really immerses you into the game experience, all right? And also, if you are with friends, it keeps that conversation going, and it gives you an outlet no matter what you're doing. So if you're sick of your 9 to 5, you don't want to do this, you don't want to do that, this gives you an outlet and gives you something to look forward to every single week to see how your fantasy football team is going to do. Fantasy football has changed my life, and that's why I wanted to do it for a living, because I was so passionate about it. I wanted to have a better way to deliver, because again, the consensus rankings, the magazines, the cheat sheets, the draft kits don't help you, right? So I've created a draft solution, which is a video training. It's like walking you through every single round, giving you all the optimal players based on my research, looking at depth charts, looking at player talent, looking at injuries, looking at the whole picture, and delivering you guys the best players to draft. And then you're going to go in with a lion mentality and a massive advantage over the competition. So check out 16 rounds, guys. Make sure you guys do smash that thumbs up. Very important, helps the channel. And comment below if you have any questions. I'll get to as many people as I humanly possibly can in the comments below. But again, how to win fantasy football, links below, everything you need. Subscribe to this channel. And again, you got to stay on top of your team. That's very, very important. And this channel is going to help you do that when you're looking at waiver wire pickups, which are basically players that really did well a certain week that are in free agency in your fantasy football league that you could pick up and roster on your team, put on your bench, or even start the week after. That's called waiver wire, right? Pick up those players that are available. All right, guys, subscribe, thumbs up. Thank you for being here. And this is Fantasy Football Explained in brief summary for you guys to help you guys get started in what I'm passionate about and what millions of other people are passionate about, which is fantasy football, enhancing that game watching experience. Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe, and I'm out.